So Fiona, what does inclusion mean to you? But before I let you answer, I'm just going to read something I took from one of the websites about personal philosophy. Is that why should where you live, which school you attend, where you work, who you know, where you are or what you can afford define the boundaries of your learning and therefore your chances in life? Which struck me as a very inclusive statement. So what does inclusion mean to you?
Oh, it's a great question. And thank you for using that quote. It's very meaningful to me, that. And I think the essence of inclusion for me is about making sure that whoever we are, whatever background we've come from, whatever our starting point, that is just that, a starting point. And that, the world is our oyster, and that's learning, that's interaction, that's social engagement, all of those wonderful things. And it's about us thinking about the person that's in front of us at that moment in time, not a sort of homogenous group of children or a homogenous concept of what a particular role or a particular background might be.
Interesting. So inclusion, therefore, is about the individual, not about the system. But we work in an education system. Can we have an inclusive system?
Oh my goodness, yeah, it's a mindset, isn't it? It's a mindset. It's about looking at what we're trying to achieve, whether that's a process or an outcome, and making that meaningful for those involved in it, so that we're all part of the experience that we create. And there's brilliant theorists that talk about this a lot. We can think about people like Vygotsky and Bourdieu that kind of really underpin these ideas with helping us to explain that we are an accumulation of all that has come before us. So in terms of what that looks like in a system, that's when we start disaggregating a bit and we think about individualized learning activities or targeted support or specific forms of intervention or the use of specific resources or technologies or working in different kinds of groups and in different kinds of dynamics, or getting children to work with the peers who bring the best out of them. It's not all about the specific processes of learning. It's about how we feel, how we think, where we are in that moment of time, and being really clear about, in this scenario, what a child wants and needs to be able to learn. It's what do we need to get off the starting block, being really, really clear about that.
You mentioned earlier you've been involved in training teachers. Is that a mindset that can be taught?
Well, I think lots of people find that an easier mindset to adopt than others, perhaps. But actually, being inclusive is just about being more open to seeing things. And sometimes we see what we've seen before. So if we think about little blind spots that we all have, we talk about the Johari window, the known knowns, the unknown knowns, the unknown unknowns, and so on. The way to kind of make those unknowns become knowns is to have them surfaced, is to see these ideas, see these things. And sometimes that's about listening and asking. We've 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. It's so that we can ask children about their experiences. It's so that we can ask families about what the child's experiencing outside of school. It's so we can ask teachers and colleagues what they already know, so that we can see where their next steps are in their understanding. So it's listen more, ask more, observe, kind of consume all these things that are in the world around us to help us develop our own understanding to move a step forwards.
Given that, can you give an example of what good inclusive practice is?
I can try. And one of the interesting things with examples of inclusion is whatever we think of as an example, there'll always be another way to make it even more inclusive. It's not a finished thing, is it? It never is. I think for me, when we talk about inclusion, there is this tendency to start from a deficit model and to start from a focus on children who can't access learning, maybe due to a physical or a cognitive barrier. But actually, research evidence shows us if we adopt a wholly inclusive mindset, it forces us to really think about what's important in a particular learning experience. And that kind of raises the game for everyone, doesn't it? And it accelerates the progress even more for those who have those traditional features of disadvantage. So everybody benefits, but in particular, those with some of the greatest struggles. So let's think of a really simple example, an everyday classroom activity. Something like we're always asking children to write, aren't we? Always asking them to write something like a story or a news report in English, or a descriptive passage in French or Spanish, or writing up a science experiment. We always ask them to write stuff down. And traditionally, that's been a very sort of pencil and paper type activity. in English language, which is then marked by the teacher. And for a lot of children, that's a kind of battle right from the outset. And they've got to tackle handwriting, they've got to tackle neatness. They're in this weird situation where you have to think right and polish your final piece of work all at the same time, because when children commit something to a book or a piece of paper, any tiny edit they want to make, they have to rub it out and then rewrite it, and it shows. So nothing ever looks good enough in the eyes of the system. So that kind of puts every child at a disadvantage in a way, doesn't it? Because every child's going to feel like whatever they've done is not going to be good enough when they're using that form of activity. And for children with physical difficulties like handwriting, or with English language barriers, or specific challenges by dyslexia or something like that, is magnified even more. And the focus then becomes the barrier to their learning, rather than the focus being the learning intention itself. And that's a really frustrating thing, isn't it? And we're effectively then asking the children with the greatest barriers to work twice as hard as those without any barriers. It's mad. It's just not right. So from an inclusive approach, we might invite children to kind of fast track some of the mundane aspects of that process to focus on what really matters. So let's think about a really simple piece of technology in every device. Let's think about talk to text. It's a brilliant feature that barely anyone uses. Children can speak out loud to say what that content's going to be, and then let the technology turn it into text. But then we're not saying that the process of writing and improving doesn't matter. What we're saying is use your energy on editing and improving rather than just processing stuff. The focus is then on the right thing. So children's time and effort goes into evaluating their ideas, improving their work, refining their choices. In other words, the process of learning rather than the process of producing. And then the best thing about all of that, of course, is with those embedded translation features, the child could speak in their own language, so thinking is there in their first language, celebrating those strengths rather than making them a barrier. And then when they finish that the focus task, then they can translate into English so that teacher can read what they've produced. We're valuing what the child's doing, not limiting it. And then finally, if you ever watch a child talk text, and I know you will have some immense experience on this, they kind of they sort of start and then stop and then go back and then they edit and they redo it, don't they, and refine it 100 times. So one of the few scenarios children just naturally do that. And I think particularly when they're working really hard to some clear guidelines and expectations about what they're supposed to be capturing, that really, that's high quality, formative self-assessment that the child wants to do from their own initiative, isn't it? That's the stuff that research evidence shows makes the greatest impact on learning. And they're totally focused on organising their thoughts and on the improving what they're doing. So yeah, that's a very long-winded way of saying use talk to text.
You started that, Fiona, by saying, it's on every device. It is. Many moons ago, speech to text was like a very special thing, and you bought a very special bit of quite expensive software, and you had to train. And then we had problems because even when they included it on laptops, the early versions, you had to go through a training program to train it to listen to your voice. And so for my dyslexic students, I had to whisper in their ear what they had to say out loud because they couldn't read it on the little training bit, which, and now we've got it and it's ubiquitous. Now, isn't that universal design for learning? You can speak to a watch on your hand. You can speak to a smartphone. You can, when I'm working with a school or a student or a family, it doesn't matter if they're an Apple family, a Microsoft family, a Google family, it's there. So you've chosen a universal design for learning example, which is lovely, because that is inclusion. It's when we don't have to think about it, isn't it? It's just there to use. But you're also right in saying, I think there's so many people who just don't use it. I wonder why that is. Have you got any thoughts?
Well, I don't think it's a conscious not using it. I think for a lot of us, we just not thought of it. Nothing's triggered that thought. And things like voice activated searching, and voice activated all kinds of things, because they're becoming more prevalent in different spaces that we live and work and move around in socially as well. I think that maybe will start to change. We hear the OK Google or the Alexa voice searches. I mean, they're great features, aren't they, for children's learning? The questions they come out with, once you've been through the silly questions that children will ask, a voice activated search, and they've got the idea, you can ask this thing anything, all of a sudden the world is at their fingertips in terms of what they can get from a very, very young age. And children who don't have to think, right, I've got the ordeal of looking up in a book or the ordeal of typing to find something. So I think, that brings about a lot of advantages as well. But going back to your question, I think a lot of it is just not thought of it. People just need these little drip ideas that can be factored into everyday practice. And the more of those we can hear and draw on, the more of a palette we have to choose from in our teaching and learning practices.
Sorry, but Bob, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I'd like to take us back to the start of the conversation, actually, where we explored the idea of thinking about the individual, but within the context of an education system. And I think this is an interesting area to briefly cover, because in my experience, working across primary, secondary, special contexts for many, many years, I never struck by really, really good teachers that they feel oppressed or constrained by a system in terms of not having the flexibility to teach in the way that they want to. And surely that's one of the brilliant aspects of being a really committed teacher, is that you have got huge opportunities to be flexible. And if we just draw this now into this context of, well, so therefore what do people do when they're teaching? What are the choices that they make? And inadvertently become gatekeepers, just sometimes through ignorance, sometimes through conscious decisions. And Carol, you've got a brilliant kind of, not throwaway line by any means, it's incredibly powerful, but it's like asking some children to leave their wheelchair outside of the classroom. If you deny a child access to a laptop that they may use as a key tool of accessing their learning. So I find it really interesting, that whole idea of what are the conscious decisions and unconscious decisions that we make as teachers that represent us as gatekeepers, which ultimately translate into, are we truly inclusive in our practice? And my personal belief is that good teachers do exactly what you say, Fiona, which is they look at the child in front of them, they take the time to think about that child and their needs, and hopefully using, for example, universal design for learning principles, teach in an effective way. So that was a really interesting start point for this. There was another point that you made that I think is also equally powerful, which is about understanding not to start at the deficit model and to be thinking about, well, hang on, truly inclusive practice benefits everyone. And a really recent example of that really hit home to me is that I had the privilege of being in High Furlong School in Blackpool, amazing special school, award-winning, and I filmed around the school, and mainstream secondary school deputy head was there the whole time. And I was going to that school the next day. And I said, I wasn't expecting to see you here. Why are you here? He said, because we work in very close partnership. We've got so much to learn from this SEND context. And then the next day, I went to the secondary school to film, and the head teacher from the special school was in the secondary school, and it was exactly the same. And how much of that goes on? We've got a study tour coming up next week at High Furlong, and I've just received contact from someone at a girls' school in Bolton, mainstream, that wants to come and visit. And it's kind of hallelujah. That's just fantastic. We can learn so much, but we need not to operate on that deficit model because there's so much benefit for all.
It's really interesting when you're saying about the perspective of the teacher, because quite often we'll hear teachers say, I can't do X because this system or this policy or this budget or whatever. And that's not an unusual thing that we hear. And I find that a fascinating statement when there might be a teacher in the next classroom or a school a few yards down the road working under the same policy or the same challenges that is doing it. Because then the perception of what the barrier is the thing that's the issue, not the barrier itself. And actually, there's quite a lot of research evidence that will say in schools, in teaching and leadership roles, we have a lot more agency than we think we do. We have a lot more capability to make decisions than we think we do. But sometimes we don't make those decisions because of a whole range of factors. And some of those are self-induced, and there might be things about confidence or fear or whatever it might be. The culture within the school, it's not that you can't do that, but you think that you can't do that. It's a sort of subtle difference. But actually, most of the time, most schools, most contexts, trying something new is encouraged and is rewarded if it's done with the intention of focusing on the needs of the children in front of you at that moment in time. When it's focused around the child or the children, you can't really go wrong there, can you? We can learn, we can experiment. We might not have it nailed first time, but that's what we're all here for. That's our purpose of being in this space.
Your reference to the Joe Harry window and what we know and what we don't know and so on. One of the things for me is that we all use technology ourselves in personal ways, like, for instance, listening to audiobooks, dictating text when you're on the move and so on. So we know the things that technology can do to support our lives, but we don't move that into our teaching. And so, we have known, what would you say? We don't know what we know. We don't realise what we know, and we don't realise how that would work for the children in our classrooms.
I was going to say there's a really, really interesting point at the heart of that. And that is, if you go into any classroom in any school, it will fit into one of two molds. It will either be framed around the teacher and teaching, or framed around the learners and learning. You can't have both at the same time. It's either one or the other. And this is a theoretical thing, but if you go into any classroom, just watch, you'll see it. And it's in subtleties like who the focal point is. You can see it in positioning and body language and resources and all that kind of classroom layout and environment. You can hear it in the language, in you're doing this for me, or how can I help your learning, or subtleties like that. And I think the reason I mention that framing around the teacher and teaching, or the learner and learning, is because in that scenario, how we bring technology into the classroom makes a big difference on how it's then going to be used. So technology that we use outside of school that's focused on a kind of top-down leadership outwards type use of technology, if your classroom is centered around the teacher and teaching, that's a very natural fit. If your classroom is centered much more, framed more around learners and learning, and incidentally, lots of people will think they're framed around the learner when actually they're framed around the teacher, but that's a whole nother debate. If you're at home, you use a lot of personal level technologies, profiles, and you're much more kind of consumer sort of bottom up type technologies. When you go into a classroom environment that's framed around the learners and learning, that's a much easier fit. So it's not that we can or can't use those on a crossover, but there is a natural fit, and there is one that just then requires a bit more thinking and interpretation, if that makes sense.
So sometimes there are real barriers, and they can, I don't like to be specific, but I'm going to be. It can often be if there's a technical manager of a system within a school, that is often my first stumbling point. A school I was working with recently, the teachers all have iPads, but they cannot put any app on themselves. If they see an app that they want to try and use, or a link they want to try and use, they have to write in a book and wait until the tech guy looks at it, whether he checks it out, whether he thinks it's all right, and whether, and by then the impetus or the excitement about doing something is all gone, isn't it? So there can be those kind of barriers. It's interesting about the crossover. I teach, and I think you do, Fiona, on initial teacher training courses. We've got young people who are very, very used to using tech in their lives. Their phones are on the desk, they're speaking to their watch, so on and so on. But the idea of using that same technology to enable different kinds of access for the kids, when you mention it to them and you say, well, you've just done that at break, you've just set a timer. And one girl was showing me, I said, oh, are you, we're ready to start then. She said, I'm just finishing my shopping list for tonight so I don't forget. I said, that's absolutely fine. Finish it and then, join in. But if I'd spoken to them about using that same technology for a child to organize their tasks during the day, if they've got executive function problems, they look at you as if, like you've done it and you're the voodoo queen or something. There are all these layers and I do get anxiety. There are lots of people anxious both about the tech, but also anxious about, I love the point you made, Fiona, about stepping out of line of what happens in that school. That school's accepted way of working. And if you dip your head above and do something different, now you see, I'm sure all four of us would argue that's a good thing. But it's quite a scary thing if you're new to the school, if you're not established, if your job's not secure. I mean, imagine the poor supply teacher. The supply teachers they have to be a chameleon into every school they go into. There's kind of, now you see, I've started saying that and now I'm quite depressed because there's so many places it can go wrong. And yet when it goes right, it's brilliant.
But isn't the point that as long as all of this is focused on the learning needs of the child in front of us, that we can't really go wrong? Because even a teacher, like you say, the supply teacher, the chameleon, I love that as an analogy. Your analogies are great, by the way, Carol. Those different kinds of contexts, if the justification is always an honest focus on the child's learning in front of us, then why would anybody argue about that? And as you point out earlier, as teachers, we are pedagogical gatekeepers. I think there was Professor Neil Selwyn's sort of very famous line, and it absolutely rings true. And we've seen kind of other research come in and kind of take that one step further. So the huge MP3 study, sort of Professor Twiney and co, they were saying technology use in school is unfortunately often for the school's purpose and for the teacher's purpose rather than for children's purpose. And that's why there's then those frictions and anxieties, because the focus is on something that's not pedagogy and that's not learning, it's on other stuff. And I'm not saying that's not important, but that shouldn't be the focus. That shouldn't be the kind of golden thread that goes through. We're here. The reason we're here is for these children's learning. That has to come first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and then the other stuff, behind it.
I find it very interesting that technology is treated slightly different than, let's say, music or PE or drama or art. So if you take a kind of mainstream primary and you've got somebody who's an early career teacher, very nervous about teaching music, not musical themselves, they listen to music, but they don't play anything, they don't sing, they haven't got that. And then what will happen within the school is that pairing up and that support, and that, I'll do music lessons with your class and with you, and and we can do this together, and you kind of pick up. We don't do that so much in technology. It's not as evident as I see it for other subjects.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there is a really fascinating parallel here. Let's use that music and technology example. So I totally hear what you're saying about, how music, is not necessarily a sort of specialism, but I bet all those teachers would listen to music at home or in the radio. In the car, and I bet all those teachers would sing in the shower or hum a little tune. It's going on, it's happening there, it's just it's implicitly embedded. And I think actually, if we look at in that scenario, the parallel wouldn't so much be music, the curriculum or the instruments. The music is the voice and the mind. That's what's hearing the music, that's what's creating the music, whistling, whatever. And the parallel there with technology, it isn't whether I can do coding at home and therefore take that into my classroom. It's, do I understand the value and the benefit of search, or do I understand the benefit?
Absolutely.
The benefit and the value of portable technologies. It's not the content stuff itself. It's the approaches and the mindset. And of course, the big glaring thing right at the middle of all of this, it just comes back again and again to pedagogy.
Yes.
And I don't mean kind of pedagogy like theories of pedagogy and replicatable methods. So, we have our pedagogical methods and approaches, which are about, this is a method, this is a way of baking a cake, this is what good teaching and learning looks like. That's great. can lift that up from there, plonk that in there, and you'll have predictable effects. But actually the powerful bit about technology from a pedagogical perspective are those implicit pedagogical beliefs woven into our practices. It's about, who do I value when I'm in the classroom? Am I valuing me as the centre point, linchpin, the teacher, or am I valuing the learners and I'm here to serve them? That's the pedagogical conversation. That's the pedagogical value.
What I'm also hearing, though, is that it is about agency. Is the agency sits with the teacher rather than with the child?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And do we need to shift that? Can we shift that?
Oh my life, what's the point of an education if it doesn't make the child agentive about their learning? No, I rephrase that slightly. Children come into school agentive about their learning. You watch a small child, they're curious, they're fascinated, they're exploring, they're trying stuff out. They fall over, make a mistake, they get up, they try again. It's there, it's absolutely there. What we sometimes are at the risk of doing in a school environment is squashing that agency in order to make sure they conform. Now, a lot of arguments are out there in the space that say, well, that's all the system's fault. That's because of this, that, and the other. It's the system. We are the system, right? So I don't buy that. I don't buy it's the system's fault, because what creates agency or squashes agency is the people in front of us. It's the experiences that we're living, that we're in. We can all teach this, the broadly, a similar curriculum, the same system, and 100 different teachers will do it 100 different ways. So I don't buy that it's the system that is squashing the agency. I think that's about the everyday interactions and about listening to children and thinking, how are we going to help them move forward? What the forward looks like, that is determined by, the more of a structural aspect. But helping them on that journey, that's down to us. We can do that.
Neatly takes us into the third question, which is, what are the 3 things that could be changed to improve inclusive practice?
So I think number 1, be more forensic in our thinking. I think we take things, all of us, myself included, we take things at surface level, as we take the generalizations too often. And in specific relation to this conversation, it would be generalizations about groups of children or characteristics, or they're dyslexic, so they need this, rather than that specific child, what will help that specific child. So being more forensic, looking at each child and each professional learning colleague as an individual, doesn't necessarily have to take more time. It just needs us to listen a little bit more and watch and see what works for that individual, and then help them and support them and guide them through that, rather than sort of ploughing in, assuming we already know what the solution is for a child that looks like that. So yeah, more forensic. I think seeing inclusion is about everyone. When you say to people, we're talking about inclusion, there'll be an assumption it means about a pocket of people, rather than actually this is all of us, every single one of us. Inclusiveness is a mindset. It's about empowering strengths as well as breaking down barriers. And we talked about this earlier a little bit, shifting away from a deficit model, where inclusion is it's almost seen as the sort of privileged allowing of disadvantaged children to access learning. That's just wrong, isn't it? Learning should be an assumed right for every single human being. So the success of that inclusive practice is where every single child is closing the gap between their current achievement and their potential achievement, wherever they are on the attainment trajectory. So inclusion is being about everybody. And then the third one, I think remembering to use the tools we already have. We can get so hung up on needing something new, needing to buy something, learn something new, train in something new. We just need to use what we've already got more effectively and more impactfully. We said earlier on, every laptop, tablet and phone can audio record, can do talk to text, can do translating, can do zooming in and magnifying, can do searching. We've got auto suggest, spell check, stopwatch, calculators, photos, videos, ways to look stuff. Whatever, Apple, Google, Microsoft, whatever, it's all there. It's all in our hands already. So we just need to think, okay, how are we going to use those appropriately for the different children in front of us? And that doesn't start with a tool. That's not like, okay, we're going to use talk to text feature. Right, everybody use talk to text. That's not inclusive, is it? That's just the same problem, but the other way around. That's in our class. There's this particular child. What's holding them back at the moment from their potential? It's not saying why are they a deficit. It's what holding them back from getting there. Which tools will help them, break through that false glass ceiling that's in place for them. So yeah, forensic thinking, inclusion about everybody, and use the tools we already have.
Thanks, Bob.
And on that final point, Fiona, that really resonates, because I was very involved in the DFE EdTech demonstrator program. And at the end of the first year of that program, it was abundantly clear that the expert demonstrator schools were spending most of their time helping schools use what they already had more effectively. And I think that that's a very important lesson for us all, actually, because if we go specifically now as to, well, what devices do schools have? And there's probably a combination of what, Chromebooks or Windows-based laptops or iPad. Now, if we seriously ask teachers, what is your understanding of the features, the accessibility features built into the devices that you use in your school? How secure in the knowledge and understanding of those features are teachers? And yet, how often do the children use those? And I often say, you know, spend 5 minutes showing a teacher how to use Immersive Reader, and then they will be able to cascade that to their learners. 5 minutes of input, a lifetime of access into all sorts of different things. And how does, back to gatekeeping here, how do the pedagogical choices that we make in themselves create barriers that technology can help us push through and really facilitate? And I completely agree with that sense of, oh, what's the latest technology? Oh, it's too expensive. And all of the reasons why we can't do things, we've got to flip it around. What technology do we already have? How are we using that to be truly inclusive? And how can we propagate that across the school community?
The most inclusive tool is our mind. It's our willingness to look at who's in front of us and use ourselves to help them get more out of the experience that they're going through.
That sounds like a lovely place to finish, actually. I mean, the kind of conversation I could carry on all day.
I could. I think I vote we meet in a pub at some point.
Yeah. That was really lovely, Fiona. Thank you.
Yeah, really good, Fiona. Thank you.
Oh, fab. I hope it was useful.